British tabloid journalism has always favored cheap headlines over thoughtful, in-depth reporting, even in World War II, when the stakes were so high and British Army soldiers were sacrificing their lives in Europe to defeat Hitler and the Nazi war machine. The best example of that occurred on the Gothic Line when British soldiers fighting desperately in Italy were labeled D-Day Dodgers because they did not brave the beaches of Normandy, but instead supposedly opted themselves for sunning on the Italian Riviera on the Adriatic Sea. To zero in on what a libelous insult the D-Day Dodger label was, one only needs to understand just the basic outlines of what took place along the 30-mile stretch of the Senio River on the Adriatic coastal plain in northeast Italy between mid-December 1944 to early April of 1945. For 4 months, the British Eighth Army, which included not only English, Scottish, Welsh, and Irish troops, but also Canadian, Polish, Indian, and New Zealand soldiers, as well as a Jewish brigade, engaged in a battle of frontline attrition with 500,000 heavily armed German troops. The aftermath of that furious nightly arm exchange, which included the regular use of napalm bombs, still reveals itself 80 years later, as the banks of the Senio are still pocked with unexploded ordnance despite decades of work to defuse and demine the area. In many ways, the Senio River battle is an epic saga that epitomizes the story of the British Eighth Army's frustrations and failures along the Gothic Line, but ultimately a blood-soaked victory. To better understand the extent of the Senio River stalemate, I visited the shores earlier this year on what seemed like a trickling, peaceful brook instead of a crucial fault line of European history. Joining me today is Marco Dalmonte, who is a 34-year-old independent, non-academic historian and who is also the president of the Senio River 1944-1945 Historical Association. Marco and the association are dedicated to informing school groups and others about what occurred on the Senio River some 80 years ago in World War II. Marco is also the author of a book published in 2021 titled The War on the Senio. The publication not only provides a vivid account of the Senio River War saga, but it also includes numerous original photos taken by the British Armed Forces before, during, and after the 4-month stalemate with the German Army. Welcome, Marco, to this podcast dedicated to the 80th anniversary of the Gothic Line Offensive and the Italian-European World War II armistice that is occurring this year. We're standing here along the Senio River outside the town of Faenza and Ravenna. It's kind of a cold, windy day. And in the distance is the southeastern edge of the Apennine Mountains. Now, 8 years ago, along these riverbanks, British-led Commonwealth troops, fighting as one of two parts of a pincer movement in the Gothic Line Offensive, known as Operation Olive, had run out of steam. As a result, the plan to end the Nazi and Italian fascist occupation of Italy by converging with American-led troops coming from the southwest and together surrounding and liberating Bologna before the end of 1944 had failed. The plan seriously underestimated the challenges of the terrain and the determination of Hitler to insist his armies fight in Italy to the bitter end. Now, you have spent years of doing exhaustive research to document the details of what happened here. You have shared that knowledge with a book you published in 2021 titled The War on the Senio. And in the past 5 months, you have embarked on a tour of dozens of towns in the Adriatic region, providing extensive original video and photographs from British and other military archives that detailed what occurred here. And although the brutal war in Italy would end in only about 5 months from what happened here at the end of 1944 and early 1945, victory was a long way from reality here, as you explained in the book. In fact, you have provided a vivid picture of just how bleak the situation was for the Allied troops and, of course, for the Italian citizens who suffered terribly because of the conflict. So, can you give us a description of why the Senio River that we are standing by today had become a no man's land with German troops on one side and Allied troops on the other side, and the Adriatic part of the Gothic Line pincer movement had reached a stalemate?
Okay, so well, the Senio has nothing special. It's just a river like many other in the Romagna region with very high stop banks, and in fact the river itself, it's not very deep, it's not very large. It's a stream, something like a canalized stream, but it was the first river in a long series of rivers like that that the British Eighth Army didn't manage to cross because of the weather. The 1945 was extremely rainy. It set a record in terms of rain, which is still is still significant even after the floods of 2023 and 2024. The German resistance and determination was extremely high, and there were a lot of problems. The British Eighth Army was short of ammunition because of wrong decisions made by industrials in the UK, in the US. They thought the war was going to end very soon, and so they decided to reduce the production of especially artillery ammunition, but the war didn't end in the summer of 1944, and so there was a very bad shortage of ammunition. There was even a shortage of people. UK had no more men to enlist, and so when someone was killed or wounded fighting here, there was no replacement for him. And so all these factors added to one another and slowly led the Eighth Army to lose its strength, its momentum, and the offensive came to a halt in front of the Senio River. That's another not very known thing about the Senio. It was not like the Germans on one side and the Allies on the other side. At the beginning of the stalemate in front of the Senio, the Germans retained the possession of both banks, and these gave them an enormous advantage because the banks are the only high point on the ground which is otherwise completely flat. That's another factor behind the difficult time the 8th British Army had in front of the Senio. There was a very wide no man's land to cross before the river itself could be attacked, and the river was a tank obstacle, a double obstacle in fact, because of the two banks and the river itself, so it was a very, very difficult situation. Morale was not good either. You probably know the story about the D-Day Dodgers and how the people in Britain especially looked on what was happening in Italy. And so from a psychological point of view, it was a bad moment for the Allies.
Now, in your book, you described that despite the stalemate here, there was still a lot of cat and mouse fighting, as well as extensive use of various types of artillery. So could you just describe briefly what that combat was like?
Well, put it in a couple of words, it was like the Great War.
That's World War I.
Yeah, the lines were fixed. There was no movement, no big attacks, but action was continuous, especially at night. That's another sad part of what happened here. There was nothing capable of attracting the attention of the media, but every day and every night, tens of soldiers and civilians on both sides of the river were killed. And this continued for 100 days. In some places, some more, in some places, some less, but around 100 days along the city. And there was a continuous fight made of little things, of little tricks, changing position every now and then in order not to get caught by the fire response of the enemy. Little tricks like not using tracers in tracer rounds in order to not show your position, but then use the tracers to set a fire, an haystack on the other side of the line in order to expose the enemy. Little things like that. And artillery fire was continuous. It was not very intense, but what was called then harassing fire. This was continuous every day, and at night the front exploded. There was a very intense petrol activity and little attacks, little raids with the objective of gaining information, trying to capture a prisoner or improve positions or simply retain the initiative. It was very much like the First World War.
The trench wars.
Yeah.
Of course, the Allied forces, they had total air superiority in this part of the battle, but it did not prove to be much of an advantage. Why was that?
Well, mainly because of the weather. The weather was not good, and almost every type of airplane the Allied have, it was too risky to take off, and then in many cases it was not possible to hit the target, so fighter bombers had to land with their bombs under the wings, and it was not very good to do that, especially with landing strips covered with ice, snow, or blanket by the fog. So it was mainly a weather problem. And another problem was that German counter-aircraft fire here was very, very accurate. And those people were very capable, and they were fighting in this way without air superiority since 1943, and hundreds of Allied planes were shot down in this region, not only during that winter, but also after that.
As we were just discussing when we were walking to this point, we're looking at the river, you were telling me about how you were here just 2 months ago with some descendants of New Zealand Maori troops who fought here. And during that time with them, you found ordnances, weapons, and bomb remnants that are still in the soil today and still are a danger. Could you just tell us a little bit about that?
Well, it's something unique for this part of Italy, but not only this one. And there were, after the end of the war, there were millions of live ordnance of every type around, and they still can be found, even after very important bonification works made by Italians, also the Italian army after the war. But it's still possible to find ordnance and relics. But along the Senio, the most common thing that can come out from underground is live ordnance. And it can still be very dangerous, as you said, because of the variety of things. Some types of ordnance can be even more dangerous today than they were during the war, much less stable. And this is a problem that will probably affect this part of Italy for another century. It's not going to stop in a matter of a few years for sure.
So as we described in the first episode of this podcast, a key reason that makes the Gothic Line story so unique is the multinational and multiracial makeup of the troops that fought here. Now, across the more than 300 kilometers that span the Gothic Line, there were more than 20 countries represented. And the racial diversity included persons of color from India, Africa, the Middle East, Oceania, as well as North and South America. So, Mark, can you describe the national and racial diversity of the troops that served along the front lines here along the Senio?
Well, even here in the right spot where we are, you can have a pretty wide array of troops. For example, just upstream of where we are, the Senio was crossed by the troops of the 2nd Polish Corps. Here where we are, the Senio was reached by British troops. And so from, not only from Britain, but from Wales and Scotland, Northern Ireland, An Irish brigade fought right here just before the final offensive in 1945. Then the Senio was crossed here in the same spot by New Zealand troops, and a battalion of that division, it was the 2nd New Zealand Division, was entirely made by Maori people. And just downstream, the Senio was crossed by other British units, by an Indian division, and a bit more upstream, a Jewish brigade was even deployed, made of volunteers coming from all around the world, including people escaped from occupied territories, so there were Germans too. And there was a pretty big variety even on the other side of the Senio. We used to think that only Germans were there, but the Germans had also a division entirely made up of people from Turkmenistan, for example, fighting along the coast. And there were a lot of Italian units, fascist Italian units, fighting with the Germans. And the Germans had enlisted and conscripted a lot of soldiers from Eastern Europe, from Poland, Ukraine, Russia, etc. People who were basically forced to fight with the Germans, otherwise they would be sent to a prison camp or a concentration camp.
Okay, so at the same time, there were two different groups of Italian soldiers fighting, and this includes Italian army troops that had joined the Allied forces after the surrender of Mussolini. And by this time of the war, the Italian partisans, the resistance or freedom fighters, had become well organized and effective in sabotage. Can you give us a brief description of their roles at this point of the war here in this area?
Well, the role of the partisans right here along the Senio was minor because of the amount of enemy troops deployed along the river. It was not possible to cross the river without being shot. And so they did an important and a huge job of sabotage and intelligence gathering and so on behind the German lines. Not much, just a few kilometers from here. It was not possible to work here with so many German soldiers present. And another important job was made on the other side of the river, supporting the Allies and guiding them. And there was also several Italian fighting units deployed along the front in different sectors, and they also did a very, very important job. They were not tasked with the main assaults when the offensive began, but they had a very important role in containing the Germans, and they suffered in some cases very high casualties because of lack of support, and some people would say lack of trust by the Allies, but we were still not an ally like all the other ones. We were to prove our value as allies, and I think we did in some way.
Well, that's a very interesting story that we're going to go into another part of the podcast, because from my research going across the Gothic line from one end to the other, it was amazing the difference in the way the Allied troops interacted with the partisans. Some places they were shunned, other places they were valued. So apparently a lot of it had to do with the ideology. If they were seen as really strong communists, maybe sympathetic with Russia, especially in this part,
Exactly.
there was a reluctance to work with them. Tell me about the Italian troops that are actually part of the Italian army under Mussolini, as I understand it. Then when the surrender took place, unlike some of their fellow soldiers who continued to fight with the Nazis, they joined the Allies. Tell me a bit about that. And they were fighting here, as I understand.
Exactly. Mussolini was put out of the government in July 1943. Then there was about 1 month and a half during which Italy was guided by a general, General Pietro Badoglio. And Italy was tired of the war. The population never wanted a war against the Allies. And so in September 1943, Italy surrendered to the Allies. That moment was very, very chaotic for the Italian army because there was no clear orders, and Italy was occupied already by the Germans. So every man was for himself, every unit for himself, and the choice was to join the Germans with no struggle at all, and to fight against the Germans, which was very difficult at the time. And many Italian units decided to fight against the Germans, not only in places where the Allies were not far from, and they would probably be reached by the Allied offensive in a matter of a few days, but even in places that were hopeless. And so these units, those who fought against the Germans just days, just hours after the Italian surrender, were some of the units that continued to fight again alongside the Allies for the entire war and up to the end. And their contribution was extended as more and more men, more and more units. So there were 4 combat groups made of Italian troops which fought along the Senio and the winter front of 1944-45. And each one was made up of about 9,000 men. And so we can talk about just less than 30,000, and this is not including auxiliary divisions and other units. These combat groups were made up of soldiers, but also partisans and volunteers gathered on the ground. They were all retrained by British personnel and equipped with British weapons and artillery and so on, and then deployed one by one from beginning in January 1945.
So the stalemate that occurred here on the Senio lasted from the middle of December until the beginning of April. Now, while the attrition on the river kept troops on guard, there were various other significant historical interesting stories unfolding behind the front lines. Now, one of these includes a tragic story of Polish troops that committed suicide after the Yalta Agreement was reached in February of 1945. Can you give us some brief details of that episode as you described it in your book?
Well, you probably know the story of the Second Polish Corps. Most of it was made up of Polish who had been captured by the Soviets and then put in gulags in the first 2 years of the Second World War. Then, when Hitler invaded Russia, the Soviets decided to join forces with the Allies, and in a very strange way, the Polish soldiers interned in Russia managed to reach the Middle East, and then they decided to fight alongside the British. So when the Yalta agreements were made and Poland was given to the Soviet Union, it was not good news for the Polish soldiers fighting here. It meant they probably would not have the chance to come back to their homes. Part of Poland was going to be not only in the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union, it would be part of the Soviet Union, and so there was very little chance they would come home and not be interned, not be taken prisoner by the Russians. And so that they suddenly had a very bleak picture in front of them, with no future, no family, not even a country to come back to. They had experienced already an entire year of hard fighting in Italy and of hardships in Russia, the Middle East, and so on, and some simply could not take more.
They committed suicide.
Yeah, they committed suicide in different ways. It was a very bad moment for all Polish soldiers. The commander of the Polish Corps even had to talk with McCreary, the commander of the 8th Army, and told him, "You'd better put the entire corps out of the line before every Polish soldier deserts." But the problem was that the Allies had no troops to replace the Polish corps, and no one that was openly on the part of the Polish troops. And Churchill, Clark all refused to give any help. But McCreary, who was a very practical and down-to-earth man, he told that we have nothing to replace the Polish Corps. So if you go away, you're going to leave a gap of 15 kilometers along our front, and this is not going to work well for you. You're not going to have a good reputation for that. So decision is yours, but just know that. And then the Polish soldiers decided to keep on fighting, not for Poland, but for giving at least to Italy what they wanted to give to Poland, some freedom.
Another interesting aspect of that is that, as you detailed in your book, there were actually Polish troops here that arrived to fight at this late stage of the war, who had actually fought against the Allies in the beginning of the war.
Yeah.
And this happened after they were captured in 1939 when Germany invaded Poland. So you give us some more brief details about that interesting aspect.
Yeah, the units were the 3rd and 4th Polish Brigade, and they were almost entirely made by former enemy soldiers. The Polish Corps was the only unit that continued to grow in strength during the fight along the Italian peninsula, despite the casualties, because a lot of Polish soldiers had been captured by the Germans in 1939 and then forced to fight with them, but many Polish soldiers only wanted a chance to surrender and join the right side. And they were always welcomed by the troops of the 2nd Polish Corps, and two entire brigades were made up of them. Not only people captured in Italy, but there were thousands of former enemy soldiers captured in Normandy and in France. We were transferred here and then trained and equipped and so on. And this always because of the lack of manpower or the lack of soldiers.
Now, a question that historians continue to ponder to this day is whether or not it was worth renewing the fighting in the spring of 1945 after the Allied forces' pincer movement had stalled. Now, as described in other episodes of the podcast, the American-led Allies forces coming up the middle and western part of Italy had their own difficulties and could not reach Bologna as planned, as was the case with the Eighth Army. Now, along with second-guessing historians, it is well known that a lot of both the British and American infantry soldiers questioned the need for more death and destruction that a spring offensive would surely entail. These soldiers were well aware their fellow Allied troops in Northwest Europe had regrouped after the near disaster with the Battle of the Bulge in Belgium and Luxembourg. They also knew that the Allied forces were crossing the Rhine River and were on the move to Berlin. So, however, as you highlighted through your research, the British and American commanders here in this part of Italy decided there were big risks if they did not pursue the military mission that they had started in 1943. So, what were these risks, and could you give us some details about that?
Well, let me first tell you that the matter of the reasons behind the final offensive is much questioned in Italy too, especially by civilians and survivors of that time. And the main reason telling that this was a right decision was that Germans still had 500,000 soldiers in Italy. And they still had a lot of positions they could regroup to, retreat to, and use to prolong the fighting in Italy. It was not sure that that so many troops, that these 500,000 soldiers, could even accept an order to surrender after the fall of Berlin, for example. The Germans were preparing defenses and other fortified lines along the Alps. And it was calculated that if the Germans were able to retreat as far north as the Po River or to the Alps, the fighting in Italy could continue up to 1947, with a lot of casualties to be added to those already suffered by the Allies and the civilian population. So it was worth to take a risk and launch a final offensive. The Allies didn't know it. It really was going to be the last one.
Well, I understand there was also concern that if they retreated to the Alps, they could actually even form a rump state to defend the Nazi ideology, and that's where Hitler was hiding out. So there was that concern as well.
Yeah, exactly. And so the offensive will add to the land. And some people called it an impossible victory to achieve, because the Allies, as you said, were trying to achieve a crucial victory, an encirclement of the enemy since 1943, and they had never managed to do so. So it was very difficult to reach this objective in the little space between the Senio and the Pop, but it was necessary for us.
So at the end of March 1945, with the arrival of spring, there was a fortunate turn in the weather. British-led Commonwealth forces, they would launch an attack along the Senio in the east with the hope of meeting up with the American forces that had broken through on the mountains to the west of Bologna. So can you just briefly describe the new offensive plan for the British-led troops, which was called Operation Buckland?
So, the first phase, first crucial phase was to cross the Senio and the next river, the Santerno, which was considered to be a defensive position even better than the Senio, because the Germans had the possibility to strengthen their defenses there for the entire winter, and undisturbed by the proximity of the Allies. Then, after a bridgehead was taken behind the Santerno, the British Eighth Army would have to decide in which direction to concentrate its forces, towards Bologna or through the Argenta Gap. The Argenta Gap was a very narrow gap of dry land between two flooded areas. One was natural, the other was artificial, flooded by the Germans. But anyway, the plan was to meet the American Fifth Army, which was going to attack just days after the Eighth Army's main attack. The plan was to meet those forces between Bologna and Ferrara, just south of the Po River. This was planned in
Briefly describe how these posed dangers and what was done to overcome them.
Well, the British Eighth Army trained for the entire winter, developed new techniques to cross the rivers of this region, which are different from any other river. So, new equipment, new techniques, and new ways to attack too. For example, the use of air power. Air power was used during the spring to knock out every single bridge north of the Senio. And one would question why they had to advance as far as fast as possible and reach the Po as fast as possible. Why to knock out all the bridges? Because the British Eighth Army had the means to cross the rivers with bailey bridges and scissor bridges and special equipment like
These were mobile, unique construction designs that they had come up.
Yes.
Right.
And the Germans did not have them, and so the solution was to make the Germans incapable of crossing the rivers, of retreating across the rivers swiftly, while the Allies had the ability to cross them while attacking very, very fast.
Now, we were speaking earlier about the Polish troops. As you noted in your book, the Polish troops were part of a decoy plan as part of this renewed offensive, to try to confuse the Germans of where the thrust of the attack would take place. Could you just give us a brief description of that?
Yeah, so there were two sectors in which the Allies and the British Eighth Army wanted to concentrate their forces. And it was very important that the Germans would not make the same on the other side of the river. So a deception plan was needed. And the deception plan for Operation Buckland was called Operation Playmate. And it called for a fake concentration of forces just south of Route 9, which is on the foothills of the Apennines.
This parallels along the ridge, and it runs from the coastline from Rimini all the way up to Bologna.
Yeah. And this was the sector where the Allies had achieved every little breakthrough during the autumn of 1944. So The Germans were like expecting the Allies to make a move like that. The Polish Corps, in fact, was tasked with two objectives. One was to protect the left flank of the main assault force, and the other one was to take part in the decoy plan. So it was a twofold task, and very, very difficult to achieve these two tasks together. So the Polish forces were divided in order to cover these two objectives, and in a very strange and peculiar way, they managed to do it. And part of the Italian forces, which we talked about just before, were part of the same decoy plan. So the fighting for the assault units was hard, yes, but it was not much easier for the decoy units too, because you are like a bait. You have to attack, but not never to achieve a breakthrough. So you're always attacking and attracting the attention of the Germans. It was quite difficult for them.
So, as you describe in your book, the Germans had their own plans for deception to confuse any British-led Allied force attack. Can you describe what they were?
Yeah, well, a very dangerous plan was called Operation Leonidas, and it was put into effect just days before the offensive of the British Eighth Army. And the plan was to hit the front line with a very extensive artillery barrage, and then the Germans had to retreat their forces from the Senio to the Senio River. It's like a failed front operation. Germans knew that the Allies had spent months in preparing an offensive, and they knew that the offensive was due, and by withdrawing to the Senio River, the Allies were very, very frightened that something like that could happen. But thanks to Hitler, only part of the plan was put into effect, and that was the artillery barrage. So the effect was that the Germans expended a lot of artillery munition just before the final offensive of the British Eighth Army. They revealed a lot of artillery positions, but they didn't take advantage of that, and they stayed along the Senio, where they were hit in a matter of a few days by the massive air and artillery bombardment preceding the Eighth Army attack.
Now, the final breakthrough, as you mentioned, occurred in what is known as the Argenta Gap. So could you kind of describe what happened at this pivotal point?
Yeah, as I said, the Argenta Gap was a very narrow gap of dry land. On one side was the Valle di Comacchio, which is a salty lake, and many areas in the entire region were flooded by the Germans. So there was only that little narrow gap of dry land where part of the Eighth Army could cross, and obviously the Germans were expecting that to be a key point, and so the entire gap was extremely fortified, and were mines everywhere. Not a good choice for an attack. But McCreary, the commander of the Eighth Army, had found a way to outflank the defenses of the Argenta Gap, and his plan was to launch a series of amphibious operations across the Valle di Comacchio.
Which was a lake outside of Ravenna, north of Ravenna.
Exactly. And between Ravenna and Ferrara. And this was possible thanks to the arrival of new equipment in forms of landing vehicles truck, LVTs, which in Italy were known with the codename Fantails. And these enabled the British Eighth Army to launch the amphibious operations. They were called Impact Plane and Impact Royals. And they were not successful in breaking the Argenta Gap, but they were successful in partly outflanking the defenses and deploying forces in a very bad spot for the Germans. After the crossing of the Senio and the Santerno, as I told, the British Eighth Army had to decide in which direction to concentrate the forces, and they decided that part of their forces would be directed to the Argenta Gap too. So the Argenta Gap was won, the Battle of the Argenta Gap, by the troops deployed with amphibious operations and by part of the troops coming from the Senio. Another important factor was that the Germans had deployed one of their main reserve divisions there, the 29th Panzer Grenadier Division. It came out of the battle in a very bad shape, and so it was one of the engagements that led the Germans to finally have no more reserves to deploy. And then after a break in their line was achieved, they had nothing to fill the gap with.
And so they retreated.
Yeah, and they retreated.
And then from how long did it take from the start of the offensive till the breakthrough at the Argenta Gap?
Well, the breakthrough there was achieved between 18 and 19 of April 1945. It is after 10 days after the beginning of the offensive. The offensive had begun on April the 9th, and there were minor operations in the Valle di Comacchio area since the first days of April, and so it took 10 days. Another important breakthrough was achieved by the 8th Army along the Guyana River, which is a very little river, even less than the Senio in terms of dimension and water gap, between the little town of Medicina and Bologna. These two were the last real battles of the Italian campaign. After that, the Germans had no more reserves, and the commander of the German unit in Italy, General von Beitinghoff, decided to order a general fallback to the Po, but it was too late, and he acted against the orders of Hitler, who wanted the ground to be defended at all costs to the end, but there was, at that point there was nothing to gain. They tried to reach the Po, but the Germans managed only in a very bad way.
And at this point, the American led Allied forces, they were coming from the west side. They were crossing the Po at about the same time.
Yeah,
that's correct.
Yeah, the first units reached the Po, but many Germans were still south of the river, and there was no means to take their vehicles, tanks and so on, to the north side. So those units, those German units which managed to cross the river Po, made it in a very bad way, using tires to swim across the river while Allied aircraft was strafing them. And there was practically no means to take a tank or a truck on the other side of the river. So
that shortly after that, the fighting stopped in Italy. That was on April 25th.
The Po was first crossed on April 23rd. Then April 20th.
It's Liberation Day, celebrated every year in Italy.
Yeah, it's Liberation Day, but it's not the end of war in Italy. The war ended on May the 2nd, and but north of the Po, it was just after the Germans were retreating, and there were only a few rear guard actions, even out fighting.
Along the Lago de Garda, as I understand, there was some. Yeah. Where Mussolini had been holed up for the last year.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it was the end for them. Some units even continued to fight after the end of the war. In the first few days of May, they had nothing in terms of equipment. They had started the month of April with, as I said, 500,000 troops and thousands of vehicles of artillery. Unfortunately for them, not many airplanes. But in terms of soldiers, tanks, the fighting at the beginning of April was almost on equal terms between the Allies and the Germans. And north of the Po, the Germans had left nothing in terms of vehicles, mainly no fuel. It was useless, practically no more planes, and they had sustained very heavy casualties south of the river.
Now, Marco, 80 years on, Europe faces similar security threats as occurred in the 1930s and 40s in Europe. This time, it is Russian President Vladimir Putin and his imperialistic ambitions to rebuild the Soviet Union empire and the Iron Curtain, and his invasion of Ukraine that has put the European continent and Western democracy at risk in so many places. Yet here in Italy and other parts of Europe, there is opposition to providing the military support to Ukraine to stop the Putin blitzkrieg, even though 80 years ago, tens of thousands of people died fighting to save freedom and democracy here in Italy and Europe. So do you think this resistance has a lot to do with the fact that the story of what happened here 80 years ago is not taught in the schools, and the overwhelming majority of the people are unaware of what happened here?
Well, most of people are unaware of what happened here, but they are anyway much frightened by the war. I meet a lot of local students. 2,000 students booked for the coming year. We have, as an Senio River 1944-45 Historical Association, we have a lot of activities on the territory, and this is one of them. Young people, students have no idea of what war is really like, and it's very useful to show them what happened on the places they know. And after having done that, they have a pretty good idea of what war is really like after having taken them to war cemeteries and so on. But anyway, there's very strong fear of war still here. I think the problem is that we are losing the perception of what war is really like, and even more of what is needed to avoid war. And I think the best antidote to war is to explore the point of view of others in any case. And that's something that is not happening with Putin.
Well, there is clearly a huge division in Europe. For example, I spent quite a bit of time this past summer in Scandinavia, where it's completely the opposite viewpoint, where people are incredibly engaged in weekly demonstrations, even at the Russian embassy to this day, to support groups for Ukraine. Everyone is very much aware and very concerned that the expansion that Putin is carrying out in Ukraine will continue if it's not stopped, and that he will just continue to move westward. But especially in the south of Europe and other parts, even in Germany, it's pro-Putin. We have Hungary, Slovakia. So why do you think there's this difference?
The fear of an expansion, an invasion can, I think, affect people in different ways, and perhaps some fear an expansion and wants to explore the point of view of the of that side instead of the other. It's very difficult. When there's a division, when there's a war, and you have to choose which side you are with, it's a defeat since the beginning, because you can't explore all the points of view, and you have to choose. And in doing so, you are not exploring the other point of view.
That was Marco Dalmonte, the 34-year-old president of the Senio River Historical Association. In closing, I should mention that Marco's and other Italians, as well as U.S. President Donald Trump's failure to recognize unequivocally that Russian President Vladimir Putin is the clear aggressor in the 3.5-year-old war against Ukraine, prompted a brave, outspoken speech by 84-year-old Italian President Sergio Mattarella. Speaking earlier this year before the University of Marseille in France, Mattarella made it clear that there is no difference between what Putin is doing in Ukraine and what Hitler did in Europe and Italy 80 years ago. As a result of that speech by Mattarella, pro-Russian hackers promptly attacked Italian government websites, and the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs said Mattarella's comments were blasphemous.